Are you ready to enter a zone unlike any zone you've ever been in? It's not positive. It's not negative. It's not good. It's not bad. That's right. It's the neutral zone. More neutral than any zone you've ever been in. Discussing.
I want to visit that zone, Richard.
That's right. That's where we're going today. Going deep into the neutral
Sunday.
zone. The most neutral part of the neutral zone. The part where
Sunday. The neutral zone. This is Clever Orbits, in case anybody doesn't happen to know that. And I'm Louis Brandmeier, and this is Richard Landy Jones Futrell. It's on your PhD, so I guess I can say it here too.
That's right. It's public knowledge.
Did you evolve out of disapproval for your middle names? I thought there was a time when you didn't like them.
I always liked my middle names.
Oh. For some reason, I guess I had the story that you didn't like Landy.
Well, I used to go by Landy as my main name, and then I switched to Richard.
Oh. I really like the idea of calling you Jones from now on.
Yeah. His name was Gravitas.
Oh man, I'm sweating a lot. I think it might have something to do with the thumb I just got.
Yeah. So background for our listeners: we're discussing the neutral zone, but something that's very non-neutral is happening right now. Louis is actually in intense pain right now because he cut off part of his thumb while cooking.
Well, just like the tip. Yeah.
Okay, just the tip. You know.
Oh, come on. That was not funny. I mean, it could be for someone not in pain. Hopefully one of you found that funny. Don't apologize to me. Don't apologize to our listeners either, because they'll, I'm sure, find that funny. Yeah, let's talk about the neutral zone. So you clearly enjoyed it a lot, perhaps too much.
I've always found this episode to be pretty fun. It's like a great example of the weirdness and the sort of megalomania of season 1 of The Next Generation. So, and just some background for our listeners. Season 1 of Next Generation has always been considered kind of weird. And it's because
chaotic.
It's chaotic. The episodes are extremely variant from episode to episode in quality and in content, and there's people going left and right, and they can't decide who the engineer is, and it's just a complete mess. And the other interesting aspect of season 1 is that this is the season where Gene Roddenberry and his crew and his folks had the closest influence, and it's where I think their vision shines in its most unadulterated and in some cases almost insane form. So the key background document, in my mind, for understanding TNG Season 1 is this thing called Chaos on the Bridge on Netflix. So it's a little documentary that's produced by William Shatner, and it's narrated by William Shatner, and he interviews a bunch of people and basically tells the story that basically you had Gene Roddenberry, who, when he originally made Star Trek, he thought, it's going to be a kind of utopian future, but he wasn't so big on the really strong utopian points, like the idea that there might be no conflict in the future and that all problems have been solved in the future and that there's no money in the future, et cetera. It's only sort of during the 70s when Gene Roddenberry was touring a lot of college campuses and giving talks and, gaining acclaim that he developed the idea as a sort of retcon that Star Trek was about this completely perfect future. And then when he got the green light to do Next Generation, now that's when he got to, really put onto film that vision that he had come up with in the interim between the cancellation of the original series and the start of The Next Generation. That's factor number 1. Factor number 2 is that Gene Roddenberry himself was an extremely chaotic and picky guy, and he kept rewriting the scripts and firing the writers and bringing in his buddies to bully the writers and the producers, and it was just a complete, sometimes the entire writing team would be fired between 2 different episodes. They were trying to, push out an episode every few weeks or so, 1 episode a week even. And so that's the 2 background elements of Next Generation Season 1, and I think they all show up in this episode. So in this episode, you've got 2 stories.
Oh, well, actually,
Yeah?
Let me add some background to that. There was also a writer's strike. Did you read about this?
I thought that was in season 2.
No, there was a writer's strike going on around this time, and so because for legal reasons, there were certain drafts of episodes that just couldn't be altered. So it's a draft midway through the production process when it comes to writing, and from what I read on Memory Alpha, this one, Maurice Hurley, who was the inventor of the Borg, basically, and did some good things with this episode towards that end, and I think this is a great first introduction to the Borg, even though it's never explicit. But he got the draft, and he couldn't alter it to some extent, which is why the episode widely is acclaimed as kind of chaotic, or another reason, why it was chaotic or kind of incoherent on some level. So yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
I really enjoyed TNG Season 1. I feel like TNG Season 1 is in many ways the closest thing. It really feels like another season of the original series with new characters. And plus there's the whole weirdness that you're seeing these sort of embryonic forms of the characters we see later. And they're pretty kind of different in Season 1 than what they become, like Data's character. You can see how there's an evolution there, so it's not really unrealistic. But in Season 1, he's sort of chipper almost. He's very childlike. He's you see him smile. Like when Riker tells him you have permission to go investigate this derelict ship, you see him actually smile. He's like the Tin Man. He's like Pinocchio. And I guess that's what Roddenberry is going for later. He turns into more like a professional, really. Actually, everyone in the crew becomes a lot more professional after the first season.
Yeah, they're also, a lot of them have not found their stride or their role yet, even. I mean, I think it was 2 episodes. Worf's been the security chief for 2 episodes. Geordi is still on the bridge, driving the ship, apparently. I kind of like it with all of the characters, basically, except for Beverly Crusher, who in the Honest trailer was described as just kind of there most of the time. Which I think is sort of accurate for this season, which is part of why she left for Season 2, and then apparently people loved her so much that she came back. But
she got replaced by Dr. Pulaski, who was even more just kind of there.
Well, she was there with a border of I really hate Data and love mispronouncing his name.
Yeah.
That was her central defining characteristic.
Pulaski's kind of reactionary. I think she's pretty interesting. But that's in the future.
Well,
for us.
Yeah, they were trying to go for a McCoy vibe with her. They wanted her. They had her hate transporters and be sort of grumpy and grumbly all the time. And so I guess in the same way that McCoy hates transporters, he probably would hate androids, and that's what her character was founded on, I guess. But anyway. So this episode, I agree. There's a lot of chaos. But did you want to do the summary? Is that where you were headed?
Well, we usually assume people have seen the episodes. But
assume that again.
There's 2 stories here. And it's not clear which one is the A story and which one's the B story, and they're very different. And so number 1, chronologically, is that they've uncovered a cryo ship, and there's a whole bunch of people in it from the late 20th century, interestingly. And they're having sort of acclimation troubles to the future. That's story number 1. Maybe it's A, maybe it's B. I don't know. Story number 2 is that they're going into the neutral zone to investigate some outposts that have been destroyed, apparently, quote, scooped up or scooped away. And they encounter the Romulans, and the Romulans say, "We're back." They literally say, "We're back." That's a great, season ender, because it introduces the mystery of what happened to the outpost, which later turns out to be the Borg, and it introduces back the Romulans.
That's just in headcanon. That's just in the writers speaking. This episode is never followed up with a comment that says, you do see this kind of thing done in Vestibular World.
I think in Q Who, Data says that something about the Borg ship matches, an energy signature or something from the bases that were destroyed. There's some line like that in there somewhere.
Well, who am I to stand in the way of history?
It's not solid, rock hard evidence.
So let's get into this. I liked it. I don't. I didn't see the seams until I read some of the reviews online around it. Like, I didn't have anything but appreciation for it previously, but, like, there are a lot of, like, things in this episode that are like, huh? What? And then there are little details that, like, I appreciated, like the guy wearing a smock, like the Starfleet officer uniform that's a smock. I mean, that's very interesting to me.
That.
Well, so it's like this dress blouse thing.
Oh,
you
yeah.
see it occasionally.
The men wearing the skirt, yeah.
Yeah, which is like, what are you even getting at? I mean, like, maybe gender roles have changed
like,
so much.
Equal. Here's what it is. It's a gender equal future. Gene Roddenberry wants it to be gender equal to serve his, utopian vision, but he also wants to have women in miniskirts. So how are you going to have your cake and eat it too? You got to put the men in miniskirts too.
That tracks. There's a bunch of other things around the uniforms though too, like Worf's sash, right? It's gold. It's gold here. And it's got very specific ornamentation on it. And then later, I don't know if it's season 2. I didn't check. But later, I know that he's got a silver sash. So that made me really appreciate the fact that either the first one broke and they had to replace it, because that sort of a thing happens behind the scenes, or in Klingon culture, he made some sort of an advance or something, which it's unclear what his status in relation to the Klingon Empire is at this point, because I know there's a lot of shifts later on throughout season 3, 4, and 5 around, like, all right, so do they like him? Do they not? Is he actually considered a Klingon? Is he acceptable? But I took great pleasure in imagining that the Klingons have an inverse relationship with gold and silver to the one that we do. Like, silver is always second best, gold is first. So I like to imagine that Worf advanced and he got what is considered first in their culture. I mean, like, and then that leads to really interesting thinking, like, some other culture may consider blocks of cement to be the most valuable thing, or like heaps of coal. So
if they're sufficiently, rare and aesthetically pleasing to them, given their specific biology.
Yeah, the scarcity of geology of elements and compounds and alloys or whatever is going to vary from planet to planet.
I mean, gold has the properties that it's shiny, so it's pretty, it's rare, and it never tarnishes. So that's the three things that sort of make gold, I think, have made gold recurrently be considered the most precious metal across cultures.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, too, to consider that aesthetics may arise out of some interrelationship between the an organism and its environment. Mm-hmm. Like, beauty as symmetry is an expression of fertility and health and vitality, generally, when we look at a woman. And so, one imagines, and of course there's that one line in Generations where the Klingon, where the Duras sisters are talking to each other, and they're looking through Geordi's visor at Dr. Crusher, and one of them says, "Human females are so repulsive." And it's just like, it's great. I mean, so, the idea of beauty isn't just culturally sensitive, but I think we could argue it's environmentally sensitive as well. Like, I mean, if there were an alien species, we would actually have evidence for the real argument, anthropologically speaking, but it's just a fun supposition at this point. Speaking of colors and appearance, the uniforms on this show change so many times. Like, there's a seam here, there's like Geordi's wearing red, and then he isn't. One imagines there was a career change behind the scenes. Like, he got really bored because he's really talented. In the autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard by David Goodman, there's an initial meeting between Picard and Geordi. And Picard sees his attention to detail, his precision, and his skill as an engineer. And that's basically why he has him recruited to be on the Enterprise crew. And in the first season or so, you really don't see that from him. So,
in the very first episodes of the first season, he's not only is Geordi not the chief engineer, they have some other chief engineer. I don't remember his name. I think he actually changes from episode to episode.
Argyle was one of them.
Yeah, very forgettable guy. And they were very clearly having an argument in the right phases of writing about who is our chief engineer.
Yep. Yeah, I think. Well, there's also Lieutenant Commander, you're going to love this, Leland T. Lynch.
Oh.
Played by Walker Boone. Okay, so anyway, and apparently that's the last time we see a chief engineer. Oh, there's a whole article, so for those who are curious, on Ex Astra Scientia, which I really appreciate. Oh, man, there's a whole article about this. It's called Chief Engineers of the Week in TNG. Of course, anybody with Google could have figured that out. So, yeah, I saw the expression from Data. That was a bit okay. And my explanation, right, is that he hasn't figured out how to express himself as a human yet, and so he's trying out things that he saw from Lore, who he met earlier in the season. Lore had a fluidity in his emotional expression, but happened to be a heinous evil villain. And so, his exposure to his brother, I think there was some emotional expression very early on. So, okay, from behind the scenes, we know it was because the character wasn't fully developed yet, right? We know that Brent Spiner hadn't figured out that he needs to be more emotionless. But within the universe, I like to believe that, Data was experimenting with emotional appearance, and then at some point eventually realized that without the programming to have intricate, complex stimulus response patterns grounded in the human genome and condition, his emotional expressions of appearance were so misaligned as to be creepy or disturbing, or this is my interpolation, really, that gives this series of Data's expressions some explanation and also some rationale for why they go away later and why they.
I think that makes perfect sense. He's collecting data. He's trying to, he's trying to act.
I'm sorry, that's too funny.
He's trying to figure out the optimal behavioral pattern that'll make him a good member of the Enterprise. And so in this beginning, he's trying out all kinds of stuff. He's trying out smiling, and he's trying out giving definitions for words over and over again. And eventually he realizes apparently the best way to operate in the Enterprise is not to do that stuff. Professional.
Well, he's definitely trying to optimize his behavior for the job, but and it's also an interesting question. When did that desire to be a human seize him? We know that there was a distinct point in the philosophical, life history of Data that he talks about with Worf later, where he says, I realized I could choose to believe that I was merely a series of circuits and junctions and memory engrams, or I could choose to believe I was a person. And so, it's really interesting because a sentient android decides that to bequeath himself with sapience when he could otherwise just assign himself this sort of meaningless value. I'm just a random assortment of things, which we saw with the drone in the 29th Century Borg technology sporting episode of the 5th season of Voyager. He, at the end of his life, makes that decision. He decides, I'm a random confluence of technology, and I should never have existed, and I'm going to kill myself now. And, so Data makes a choice, and one imagines at some point he also made a specific choice to emulate humanity, to be as human as possible. And I'm curious about what it was or how that worked for him, and then, the various expressions or iterations of him attempting to be human, because he has to be functional in Starfleet, so he's got to limit the expression of that smaller program of being human in such a way that it can be expressed while he can maintain his job, I guess. So there's not a psychology of Data, but a strategic internal dynamics to his programming that actually has me curious, because I've never thought about it or tried to put it all together. So this is a really good tangent. Thank you, Neutral Zone, which which gave us one slight expression that was seemingly out of place that we can assimilate.
Yeah, this is all commentary. Theory. This is all footnote on one 3 millisecond long expression that Data gives us.
Which basically, Richard, we're writing the first iteration of the Star Trek Talmud. In case you were wondering.
That's right. That's
right. We are the early church fathers. I love that. That is my favorite thing I've said in a month about anything, I think. And I've said a lot of things. So, did you get the vibe of this being kind of the balance of terror minus the battle with the Romulans plus these random 20th century people? Because that's kind of what it felt like to me.
They very clearly, like let's bring it down to brass tacks. They very clearly just stole a bunch of plot elements from a bunch of original series ones. So on the Romulan side, story number 2, they, outpost destroyed, going into the neutral zone. Here's the Romulans. They're decloaking, And then in story number 1, well, we found a cryogenic ship. And, oh, look, there's a whole bunch of people from the late 20th century inside, exactly the same century that Khan came from. And
except they aren't superhumans.
Yeah, they're not superhumans. They didn't copy everything. But
they're just kind of assholes. Yeah.
I really wonder if this was supposed to be 2 different episodes.
Well, they say that in the writing process, this was supposed to be the first half of a 2-parter originally, and then the second half would have been the Borg showing up and the Federation teaming up with the Romulans to fight them, which would have been really interesting.
That sounds pretty ambitious for the season 1.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, it's a very different direction for them to go in. But I totally agree. So what else did you see?
So, the main thing that I remember in this, actually the main detail that has stuck with me from this episode is the fact that there's no authorization protocol on the comms. So these random guests on the ship can just call the captain and they can just go to the bridge. They have that level of trust on the Enterprise. They don't need any kind of authorization. And that's sort of emblematic of the sort of radical, audacious utopianism that Roddenberry is trying to push, where we really have found a place here where there is no conflict. Everyone is professional. We don't need to have rules that say you can only call the captain if you know some code or whatever. And it's even the utopianism is also expressed in the fact that for these 3 people who are brought back to life from the 20th century, for them, this is essentially heaven. They literally died. They were literally brought back to life. They were literally resurrected, and now they're in this utopia where all the pain is gone. There's no more money. There's no more want. There's no material want anymore, as Picard says. There's even this moment where when they're reviving the people, Data's confused about why people cryogenically froze themselves. And Crusher says it was a fad in the late 20th century. People feared dying. It terrified them, as if in the future they've overcome this fear of death. That's how,
I know, right?
That's how audacious this vision is in the first season. And there's also a lot of stuff in other episodes of the first season about humans becoming gods and stuff. And it's just very clearly, that's why I say it's kind of megalomaniacal. But there's actually a lot of lines in this episode that are kind of metal. And when they start talking about death.
Please. Let's out with them.
When they're talking about this musician who they brought back to life, and he apparently drunk himself into a horrible death. And the Doctor characterizes him as too afraid to live, too scared to die. There's a lot of stuff about death here. This is serious stuff, and it's something the first season's always a conundrum because it is chaotic and it is objectively, the pacing and chaos, and it is objectively messed up in a lot of ways. But there is this insane vision to it that I find, if not compelling, entertaining.
Yeah, I definitely felt like that thing about death was overstated at the very least.
I like it. I like that. There was that would be a huge thing, right? If they didn't fear death anymore, that would be such a huge. That would change everything about everything. But it's just
also recognize who was saying it. I think it was Data, right? I mean,
I think it was Dr. Crusher in response to Data.
I think if we go back, it was Data. I'm not sure, but what was interesting to me about that was like, yes, it does seem silly, and it does seem people fear death in the 24th century. Did you see the siege of AR 778 or whatever?
Yeah, that's post Roddenberry though. This is Roddenberry's world right here.
Okay, so we're feeding his vision. We're trying to understand his vision. I see. I'll get with the program.
I mean, maybe you can. I mean, part of the way that's expressed is in Picard's uncompromising attitude, like even going into the neutral zone, even facing the Romulans. He says, no, we're not going to strike first. Yes, we are going to seek, peaceful reconciliation or whatever, an alliance, some kind of understanding with these people. Picard has this sort of uncompromising vision. And maybe like when he started off on the Enterprise, he sort of pushed that on everyone, even to the point that they started to not fear death because his leadership was so inspiring. And then later on it became more of a sort of professional, let's solve this problem sort of thing.
Seriously? They stopped fearing death because of his leadership? Okay, I was just trying to really figure out for the first time in a long while. You were so ambiguous. You were so ambiguous as to be like I couldn't tell. So yeah, the episode was good overall. So speaking of Picard and his leadership, he's much more doctrinaire, militaristic by the book. He's less approachable. And that accords with like the first year or the first foray into commanding a new ship. I imagine it would be like this, where you've got to prove your authority and you've got to like be the top dog and knock anybody else around if they threaten or mess with that. And so he's kind of overly aggressive in his expression of his leadership in the first season. Shut up, Wesley. I mean, like, he's very understanding later and supportive of Wesley. So, like, I think it's not so much a function of him, the character, as the time when he started. And this is his first year. I mean, he's been a captain of a ship before. He captained the Stargazer, and he was there for a pretty long while. He did really well with it. But it's a much bigger ship. It's the Federation flagship, and it's a new crew. So he's got to assert himself in a very particular way that curtails any disciplinary issues right out the bat. And I think he does that very well, and then comes off as an asshole most of the time because of it.
I think he's he's certainly distant, and he can be doctrinaire. It's interesting to note, though, in this episode, what he's not, I'd say, overly aggressive, and what he's definitely not is insecure. So, like, two scenes. So there's the part where they're having their conference in his ready room, and, the banker guy starts calling in and causing trouble. So Picard doesn't, tell Riker, shut this guy down. He doesn't yell at the guy. He actually goes there, and he actually faces the guy face-to-face and says, we'll look into it. And he doesn't, get angry at the guy. He just says, please, we're in a sensitive situation. Don't use the comms. So he's, he doesn't seem to be threatened. The other instance showing his power as a leader is that when they're facing the Romulans and the banker guy has gone onto the bridge, and the banker guy actually interjects and says the Romulans don't know anything. Picard, if he were insecure and just trying to establish his dominance, he could say, get this guy off the bridge. He interrupted me. That's terrible. But what he does is he actually says, he does say, like, security guards restrain the guy, but he says, in fact, he's right. So he has the security and the humility to acknowledge that this person who is, nominally usurping his power in some way is actually correct and has actually made a real contribution. That's part of this idea of how humanity has transcended all of its petty properties or something. So I think Picard is definitely distant and doctrinaire. I don't know if I'd say he's aggressive. I don't know if I'd say he goes too far.
Yeah, I agree with your toning down of my interpretation. He never is exactly aggressive, and we really need to go back and watch this. You know what? I think I'm going to put a dampener on all Next Gen episodes. We need to watch these in sequence. Because there's a development, just like in DS9. Like, it's an artwork, it's a long-form arc narrative. It's just subtler with Next Gen. Like it's usually marked by the length of growth in Riker's beard, more so than, like, the presence or absence of the Dominion on Deep Space Nine. So, anyway, yeah, This is good, though. I mean, so back to the Borg. There's something that I saw here that was really interesting and cool, right? Let's say it is the Borg, which, later on, as you said, Data points out. And both the Romulans and Starfleet are trying to basically get a read for the others' military strategy, strength, technology, etc. And what I think was going on was the Borg were actually doing that to both of them. So they scoop up outposts on both sides of the neutral zone, recognizing the strategic value and import of that territory, knowing that both superpowers, relatively speaking, would come out and send a ship, at least one ship, to try to figure out what's going on and to intercept, head off at the pass anybody who's coming. And so I like to imagine there was a Borg ship observing from the outside, scanning those two vessels. And this would be a really great, crafty, clever, worthy of a Romulan type move on the part of the Borg. And I like to think that the Borg's overall intentions and strategy shifted over time. We see this from, they only want your technology and systems from Q-Who to them taking Picard. And then later on, it seems like a major part of their strategy is to assimilate people, is to incorporate your biological distinctiveness. So it is interesting, considering the type of species that they are, that the shifts in overall intention and strategy would be so close together in time. If the Borg, and then this leads to the question of how long the Borg have existed and, what is going on with them. But I guess maybe if you're a complex cybernetic organism continually adapting to what's going on around you, those kinds of subtle shifts in orientation and intention would come about quickly. So anyway, that's me attempting to fit in.
We need to consider our sources. So how is it that we know in Q-Who that the Borg are only interested in technology? Well, it's because Guinan said so. That's basically the main source of information. That's true. Maybe she's just wrong.
Q said so.
Well, he's a trickster.
So maybe it's false. Yeah, that's also a possibility. Well, anyway, I had a couple lines that I really appreciated in this episode. The moment the woman wakes up, or before the woman wakes up, Data says she was a homemaker. Must be some kind of construction worker. Yeah, I'm just oh, Data, you're so cute. And then there was a moment. This was another Data line, actually. When Sonny, the musician, says, "Oh, so you're a robot?" And then this is just awesome. Data says, "There's a very distinct difference between an android and a robot," and then he does not explain. It's just okay.
In fact, it's never explained.
It's never ever explained in the show. I imagine a robot is automated, whereas an android has some level of sentience and sapience. But that's me deriving, right? So, also the idea of a pit woofie. I looked that up. I looked up a pit woofie. Yeah. and this actually led me to realize these three people, right? So early on, the Troy says the Romulans are fascinated by humanity, and so that led me to get curious. All right, so we're talking about human nature here. It's not ever really very cleanly or very well addressed in this episode, the idea of human nature. There are stabs taken at it, there's dialogue about it, but there's not a sustained, meditative, coherent sort of message, or at least some of the reviewers assert that, and I think I'd agree. Except when you look at the humans who are awoken as a representation of modern 20th century humanity. You get, their distributed expression of human nature, the lust for power, money, and control with the financier, sentimentality and empathy with the woman. Those are her two primary traits, other than crying. which I'm I'm joking with that. She doesn't cry that much. People complain about that, but it's totally understandable. And then there's the lust for sex and for pleasure with the druggy musician. So, in contrast to this, we get Picard talking about how people are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated want, hunger, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy. And I like that. I mean, I like the progressive sense that humanity has developed over time. That's really charming and delightful and totally flies in the face of postmodernism. Like postmodernism, of course, is this denial that any narrative captures or meaningfully articulates human nature or what's going on, and that any story-like structure cannot totalize it all. It can't make sense of it, and any one that we try to use won't work. So there's this very modernist, rationalist assertion and implication that we have become better over time as a species, and that is a judgment that we have the right to make. And I want to believe, which is funny, right? That's the line from the X-Files. I want to believe that there is a communal, global species telos, like a direction, an end, an aim that we can have over time, maybe something like making us a multiplanetary species is for SpaceX and Elon Musk's companies. Like for us, we were at one point and then we got better. So this is actually a real subtlety in Star Trek. We always talk about all the details, like it's a socialist utopia or there's equality for women or anything like this. But all those are things that are achieved within society over time based on progressive changes, transformation of individuals, policies, governments, and a whole host of things. And so, people accuse Picard of arrogance here, and he does come off as kind of a little bit judgmental in ways that I think the later Picard doesn't fit as precisely with. However, he has a certain measure of pride in what humanity has accomplished and what it is no longer. And I think it's the quintessential Star Trek vision here. I think even more so than the original series, we get in these lines the classic vision. We talk about Roddenberry's vision. We are no longer obsessed with accumulating things, which, it's not that we're obsessed with accumulating things. It's that we're instantiated in an economic system where that's the thing that we're all taught and trained and practiced in doing in order to survive and then to have some semblance of thriving. Of course, when you buy that hamburger, what comes with it is the promise of happiness and the utter and complete failure of that hamburger to deliver actual happiness or that vacation or that car or that job or whatever. This is the great con of selling anything, is that you're selling happiness, but you need to realize that you're actually selling nothing. You're selling something that can't fix that promise. But we have eliminated want, hunger, the need for possessions. That is awesome. That is accomplishment. Want, it's tricky because I like the idea of desire motivating, and even the desire to what? Better yourself or improve yourself, enrich yourself. That's the challenge that humanity is faced with, which is so cool. What if that was all we had to worry about? Wouldn't that be awesome? So, our mission is to go forward. Still so much to do, so much to learn, he says at the very end. Despite its relative incoherence, this episode does manage to give us a really clear vision, in parts, of how humanity has evolved in a way that is distinct from the original series, distinct from Deep Space Nine, distinct from all the latter incarnations that are gritty, grim, dark, and, have difficulty articulating this same hopeful optimism. And, so I also love, what do you think about all that, by the way? Let me just leave it there.
Yeah, that's the Picard as a mouthpiece for the Roddenberry vision aspect of this. There's an interesting aspect of something Picard says in one of those conversations, and I'd be curious to get your take on this. So when in Picard's first talking to the banker guy, the banker guy says, it's not really accumulation, it's not really money I'm after, it's actually power. And then Picard says something to the effect of that power that you're seeking is actually illusory. And this is very interesting to me because it seems like he's saying not only does that kind of power not exist now, it seems like he's saying it actually never existed. And this is very surprising because power, I think, in my mind, it definitely does exist. And what the guy talks about is, what the banker talks about is his desire to control his environment, to be free. And Picard says there is no such control, there is no such freedom. It's a very interesting metaphysical statement that maybe the drive for power is inherently futile, and it never could have worked. What do you think of that?
Oh, I love that. Thanks for highlighting that. That's a really subtle, like we know that he reads Shakespeare, he reads philosophy, he complains that the study of philosophy isn't as prominent as it was or something to, I think, Wesley. So like Picard, really, for this podcast, is our man. Like he is the guy, and maybe Sisko and a little bit Janeway. I mean, Kirk was not known very much for his philosophizing. Archer wasn't known enough for anything. And you know, there's a different philosophical orientation in Discovery, and then in the Kelvin timeline. I mean, we've already dignified the Kelvin timeline well beyond what most people will do. But yeah, Picard here, he evinces, he gives evidence of a great deal of subtlety in his thinking, and you know, maybe even exposure to Buddhist texts or Hume or something like this, where he gets that we on some level have to surrender to forces bigger, stronger, more complex, more powerful than us. We don't know completely what's going on. We are humble enough to recognize that while we're still really noble, which in this same season he quotes at length Shakespeare, how noble a thing is man, how strong in reason or whatever, to Q. So he's proud of all that we are, but he also realizes the limitations on what we are. And I think that is also an accomplishment, like the willingness to admit one's limitations and to notice how we are not all powerful. And especially his interactions with Q, I think he has had the experience of seeing how he's not all powerful. Yeah, so I think it's great. I think it's a great comment that he makes, and a great challenge to 20th century practice and lack of philosophizing, honestly. So, however, something that I think is definitely worth noting, well, two things that were also really hilarious. Number one, that woman just fainting when she sees Worf.
Yeah, and there's funny music when that happens, too.
Yeah. Some reviewers complain about, like, oh, you had to pour on the comedic cues, huh?
Music's pretty cutesy.
Yeah, well, that's the first season, generally. And then the look of stress on Riker's face when Picard objects to the financier's comparison of the Enterprise to a cruise ship. Like not only, cause it's like Chekhov's gun. Have you heard of this?
Yep.
Yeah,
but we can explain it for our listeners.
Sure. So if in a story you see a gun on a gun rack in someone's house, that gun has to get used at some point in the plot, or else it was a worthless, trivial detail to be included. And I don't necessarily agree with that as a general principle. However, it tends to apply and works well enough, generally speaking. And so Picard specifically tells Riker to keep these people out of my way. And Riker fails so miserably that one of them contacts Picard in the middle of a meeting, right? And then you just see you see Riker like so upset. He's just like, he's putting his hand on his face and just like, this is bad. And so I really appreciated that, because we don't ever really see Riker uncomfortable in that way, except for early on when he's still kind of establishing himself. So, speaking of music, you were speaking of music, weren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for playing. the music is great, except for that, comedic cue throughout the episode. It builds this overall ramping up the edge and drama of the situation without bordering into melodrama. And it's an elegant expression of this unease about what's going on and what might happen next. And I liked how there was this disjunct between the music and the financier, like, finding his way to a turbo lift into the bridge. Like, what's going on with him, one would imagine, should have some kind of association directly with him, right? That's what we see in scenes today. If somebody's walking with a gun into a terrorist's house to capture him, I'm thinking of 24 season 5, late season 5, like, we have this dramatic tension music, like dun 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 dun. And here, the music is the emotional tone of the situation, which the financier doesn't process. He isn't present to it. He doesn't know that this is going on. And so, like, it was a really subtle thing, and some people might accuse it of either being a mistake or being, like, cacophonous, meaning the music does not go well with this scene or the actions and blocking of this character. But, like, what I perceived and what I experienced was the situation is so intense. Okay, so of course I come from this energetic perspective, right, where if 900 people on a ship are feeling a certain way, those other 100 people are going to feel something. They're going to on some gut, intuitive, at least some of them, level, feel what's going on. And so, like, I like to imagine that, not only is he, and his situation, actually, I think if we dignify these characters a little more than most reviewers do, their situation is really interesting. Like, he wakes up, and everything that, not that this plays with the scene that I was just talking about. Like, so one view is that this scene really should have had music to go with his particular through line in the episode, and that would have been interesting. And I see that view while I disagree with it. I like that the emotional undertone of the fact that there's this menace in the neutral zone, and maybe it's the Romulans, and maybe we're about to see the Romulans is happening. And I also feel like, on the other hand, the experience of these people is totally interesting. And with Claire, she's, of course, heartbroken. Everyone that she ever knew and loved is gone. With Sonny, it's just like, all right, a new chance to fuck some more groupies. I mean, like that's, and maybe drink nice martinis and maybe find new types of drugs, or play music or have parties. Like, he's just like, this is great. I'm going to fuck up my body again and maybe die a more horrible death. I mean, he doesn't say that, but that's probably what would end up happening for him. So the most coherent, rational articulation of a 20th century person meeting and dealing with the 24th century is this financier. And he does it, his insecurity gets expressed as his rambunctiousness to control and take ownership over the situations around him. One imagines he was some kind of an entrepreneur who was used to walking in a room, reading the room, figuring out how to manage the room, and getting control, because ultimately he wants to be safe. He wants to thrive. He wants to be happy. And his only concept of how he can do that is by taking control and interposing himself, asserting his power and authority. And so, I think the real story of Star Trek here is that what wins out in human nature, and it's funny because we have all of these aspects in our makeup, right? Desire for pleasure, power, sex, control, freedom, empathy. Claire was even empathizing with the people whose lives she had missed in her bloodline, as far as I recall. So, empathy happens to be the one. If we give in to empathy, is what I'm seeing in this episode, then the thing that will turn out is our civilization being more like the socialist utopia of Star Trek. Rather than, if we all continue to obsess with power and this illusory control, then we'll come out as someone different, maybe more like the Romulans or something. So anyway, it was interesting for me, or it has been just now to look into what his experience was like, because it must have been very terrifying. And he even says this to Picard. He's like, this is, like, uncomfortable for me. And I liked that because, like, he's a straight shooter in that moment. He's not like a Machiavellian trying to make everything fit his puppet strings. He's like a guy trying to deal with some strange difficulty in coming to the future. So anyway.
You saw that his old tactics weren't working. He's an intelligent guy, uses some new tactics. He just, tells it how it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's good that I feel like he is a bit caricature-ish in the fact that he's, like, interested in how his stocks are doing, and he wants to talk to his lawyer in Geneva, and he wants to talk on the phone. That's a bit caricature-ish, but you can tell that he's an intelligent guy. And so he's not a complete caricature.
Yeah, he is personalized enough to, I think, be dignified in this episode, which, anyway, I should probably never read other people's reviews because I'm mostly critical of other people's reviews, because I assert that all of these have value, and not just because I've seen them infinitely many times before ever watching them for the podcast. Though that is the mere exposure effect bias. It's too late for me to evaluate any of these as negative because my nervous system treats them all as familiar and comfort food, which is part of the point of this.
Despite the messed upness of this episode and the whole first season, this is a really memorable episode. I remember this. I remember the fact that they didn't need authorization to do the comms. Last time I saw this episode before I watched it for this podcast was, I think, 6 years ago. And I still remembered it quite clearly. It was because of this really audacious articulation of this future utopia. He sells it, this thing which is so incredibly idealistic that it seems ridiculous, but it's sold with complete straightness in this episode, and it's quite cool.
Yeah, it does a brilliant job of just that. I mean, whether it works as a complete story or works as the best version of this story is I think, in question. But speaking of characters, there was one moment that I really loved. There was this moment of self-disclosure with Worf. Like, literally no one is talking about Worf when he says all the shit that he says. He's like, but Captain, the Romulans, they killed my family at Khitomer, and they are without honor. And it's one of those first kind of obtusions of Worf. Someone somewhere should really write that paper, The Obtusions of Worf, where he says things like, Klingons do this, or Klingons do not do that. And he's just really being clear about distinguishing himself, making himself obtuse from the rest of the crew. And so, in that moment, there's this deep, like, Klingonness. There's like, okay, the self-disclosure, the moment when he shares about his parents, I think it straddles the line between him just having an emotional outburst and a sort of culture shock moment where he's like, oh my God, I've had this trauma. Because it's similar to what we see with Michael Burnham with the Klingons, where they killed her parents. And they killed them in front of her, and she's traumatized, and she's, on some level, rip-roaring and ready to go react to them. Whereas with, Worf, it's a very similar situation. So I like to imagine that it's the 24th century. He's been enculturated in such a way that he's letting the bridge crew know that he is emotionally compromised, potentially. And maybe it's not right to attribute that level of self-awareness to him in that moment, because he was kind of interrupting and co-opting the action and, like, blurting out. But I like to read it that way. I like to read that he was helping everybody else out. And then there's this other thing, which I noticed in Clues, and then I also noticed here, which is the Riker stare. Because when Worf begins to blurt out, Riker stares the hell out of him, like as if to say, non-verbally, is this going to be a problem? Is Wayne Brady going to have to choke a bitch? Like something along those lines. I don't know if that reference was quite appropriate, but anyway, I appreciate Worf and his expression in those moments. Yeah,
I almost wonder if Worf is being set up in that moment as, like, an example of a species that has maybe not made its way out of its infancy as much as humans have.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as this is another one of those contrasts, right? Just like Lily Sloan on first contact with Picard, like Picard, humanity has developed to the point where it has a new type of blind spot. Humanity, at least in the incarnation of Picard, isn't looking or isn't viewing the world from a concern and a worry for everybody's trying to manipulate me. And what scheme within scheme within scheme is being played upon me, which is why the 20th century financier sees the Romulans in their attempt to manipulate the Federation to giving them the information they're looking for, whereas Picard doesn't, because Picard has the bias of his 24th century civilization obscuring this thing from him. And with Worf, yeah, there's a lack of self-discipline and self-control that he gives evidence to that Picard doesn't. So the contrast, you're right, there's contrasts all over the place between humanity in the 24th century and humanity in the 20th, and then the Klingons as well. And I think this episode is getting better and better. So I really appreciate this. But
good.
There are two major things left to talk about, unless you've got something really big. Please.
Well, I think we could focus a bit on this fact that it's the 24th century guy, because of his sort of distrustful nature, who is able to see through the Romulan ploy. And there's a little bit here of a, chink in the armor of the utopian vision, which is that when you are now interacting with another species which is not utopian in this way, maybe you do need some of that old, power-grabbing instinct to really figure out what's going on.
So what one might suggest is that the human nature, the human nature and the ideal vision of the future of humanity portrayed in Star Trek both gives us an ideal to look up to or to aim at or to move towards, and also, at least in this episode, seems to suggest some of its own criticism. It seems to suggest what's missing in that vision and a need for even that vision to be corrected by critical examination, engagement from the outside with the things that are not it.
I think that's an interpretation of what's going on here, which is very strong. And you see that in some later episodes, like most strongly in the Chain of Command episode, which we've already talked about, and our viewers should check out our podcast on that.
Down, full, light. Go ahead.
Right. That's the main point I wanted to shine a light on right there. So what were your 2 points?
So the Romulans, there's a lot of stuff about the Romulans specifically, and then we're just going to mention this in passing because I really don't want to deal with it. Memory Alpha basically lists a mountain of continuity issues, and I don't care. I'm going to turn a blind eye very willingly to these continuity issues. Everything from the fact that there's a Romulan attack in the neutral zone in an episode much earlier in season 1, or the claim that there is, and that's why the Enterprise has to get back quickly, conflicting with the fact that this is the first time we've heard anything from the Romulans in forever. So, or maybe, so we could do that work. I just don't want to do that work. Does that make sense? We could stretch. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, if anybody cares about all that, we can do another podcast, and I'm sure we can come up with some good stuff. But I like the portrayal of the Romulans here. There's this interesting consistency with the original series where there's a distinction between our sensors being able to pick up a disturbance in the area and whether or not we can also see them, on the other hand, like the visibility. And so there's this Cold War around, can we develop sensors that enable us to see into the cloak? And it actually goes back to the Enterprise incident, because Kirk, I think, is talking to the Romulan commander, and she says, our scientists, knowing that this cloak has been stolen, will find some way to break this cloak very soon. Or vice versa, with something along those lines. Something along those lines, where each superpower is trying to match and or beat the technology of the other superpower, and there's always going to be this race. And so I kind of like that it's still going on here, implied by the fact that the Enterprise can detect the presence of a ship, but they can't see it. So the cloaking technology is just a little bit beyond what the Federation can handle or deal with. And it must be really good because, the Romulan cloaking device, as it stands here, they must have been so embarrassed by the loss of their cloaking device that they worked really hard for a really long time to develop one that takes forever for the Federation to break. Because they don't break it. For the rest of the time we see Romulans in fiction, nobody can actually detect. There are moments, right? And I'm sure as we get into the Romulan episodes, we'll see more moments where something's leaking or whatever, such that the cloak is broken. But generally speaking, it doesn't get broken. So it's very strong. And then the way the Romulans are presented. So the Enterprise D is huge. It's the equivalent of a small city in space, 1,000 people on it. And the Romulan Warbird is huge compared to the Enterprise D. It's epic, dramatic, mysterious, and just mean-looking. And it's the first time as well that we get the general connection of green with the Romulans, which is kind of their thematic color for the rest of the 24th century. And I liked seeing Marc Alaimo, who also plays Gul Dukat, as the Romulan commander, except the other one was just kind of a little bit too aggressive. The one who was not Marc Alaimo, I wasn't even clear who was the commander. I just got a general sense that they were both sort of authoritative, and they've got a really long bridge that's kind of foggy in the background, or
maybe they're two consoles.
Yeah, maybe. That would explain it, right? I did like that these uniforms are halfway between the TOS and the TNG Romulan uniforms. Like there was sort of this sash thing that they're wearing. And then, the fact that it says that they say, "We are back," like that was pretty good. I mean, I know it was a little melodramatic, but we haven't seen the Romulans since season 3 of TOS. It's been like 30 years for people. I guess if they've been watching the movies, they've seen some of the Romulans. But I do like, and I guess this kind of becomes overused, right? We have it in Balance of Terror. We have it in Battle of the Binary Stars. We have it here. We have it, between Best of Both Worlds and First Contact, like this great enemy. They have returned. Dun, dun, dun. Well, I mean, I thought the line from Marc Alaimo itself worked because, we are back. He's just very arrogant, and there were things that needed tending to. What do you think that means? You think they were, cleaning their garden?
Yeah, I don't know, and I think that's never answered. It's quite mysterious. There's a lot of stuff in this episode that's very mysterious. What? Yeah, they definitely imply that there's a real task they were working on, maybe an enemy they were fighting, maybe a technology they were developing, and they just dropped that.
That's a good story. I really want to hear that story from somebody.
It's very intriguing.
So, I mean, I think overall, not to rush to judgment, but I'd give this about a 9 out of 10. I mean, there was enough of a jagged edge for it to be right on the line. And one of my final comments was that Star Trek itself is an ideal that its own episodes sometimes miss the mark on, however hard they're trying. And, I think the unique thing about Star Trek as an ideal isn't just what we said before, which is that it's a mythology that incorporates philosophy and science and critical thinking, but also that the ideal itself incorporates its own criticism and the necessity of its own criticism. I think that's what we've discovered here that's really cool. So, someday when we write our literary treatise on the nature of Star Trek, which I think we should, by the way, in case you were wondering, this is a real option for us. Or maybe this will be the thing we share at the STLV next year. This feels like kind of some of the best stuff. I actually honestly think we should go back and listen to everything we've recorded so far and find the greatest hits and then share those in one presentation. But anyway, this is neither here nor there. So final thoughts on the episode. a 9 out of 10, yeah, about on the line.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really talk about the issues, pacing issues, but, whatever. You can read negative reviews elsewhere.
Yeah, that's not what we do. That's not why we're here. Tune in next week at the same bat time, the same bat channel. We will continue marching on into the world of the Romulans with the next Romulan episode, or the next salient Romulan episode, because Romulans sometimes just show up randomly. It will be the episode The Defector, which is actually really good. And then very soon we're going to have Michelle Specht from Star Trek Continues on to talk about To Boldly Go. And then also very soon, Calypso, the new short trek from Star Trek Discovery, comes out on Thursday. I'm really excited about that because it's set 1,000 years into the future of Discovery. After Daniels, after the temporal Cold War. So cool. Final thoughts, sir?
Pretty good app.
I want you all to know that I took one for the team here. I have been in continuous pain. There's this scene from Family Guy.
I'd like to acknowledge you for continuing to deliver commentary while experiencing
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that, man. The thing that I was reminded of was this episode of Family Guy where this guy, they're in a hospital and he falls into like this container full of like dirty hypodermic needles. And so they just they continue talking. And at some point he wakes up, he stands up and he yells, "Why have you not called someone?" And he falls back down. Because he's obviously still alive and he's just like slowly dying from all these needles. So like for me, the fact that I even mentioned that I was still in pain occurred sort of like that scene. But if you love us, if you appreciate what we shared, discovered, created here, if you disagree or disliked it, please engage through the comments. Like, share, subscribe, dislike if you like. Join us next week. Thank you, Richard, as always. Very much appreciated having you on the show.
It's a pleasure. Good luck.
And good night.